Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Rashonda Lanier Jackson. I serve as the Community Engagement Manager at PlanRVA. I see a few more folks are joining us. So I'll do like a 30-second countdown in my head. All right, so with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon again. My name is Rashonda Lanier Jackson. I serve as the Community Engagement Manager at PlanRVA, and I have the lovely opportunity and the privilege of introducing Jovan Burton. Before we jump into introductions, I just wanted to provide a little background on PlanRVA and who we are. And so PlanRVA, which was previously known as the Richmond Regional Planning District Commission, was established in 1968 by the Virginia General Assembly. We take pride in being one of the only agencies where representatives from the 9 localities come together to plan for the future of our region. We see, we convene, we plan, and we shape Central Virginia's future. And as the seer, we identify future opportunities for our region. As the convener, we bring local governments to discuss regional challenges and collaborate on a way forward. As the planner, our team of experts draft a plan of action based on the needs and input from our community stakeholders. And as the shaper, we leverage resources to solve our regional challenges. Our program areas of focus include emergency management, environment, transportation, as well as community development. A few of our major work successes include the Don't Trash Virginia campaign, Connect 2045 and Bike Ped RVA 2045, which are our long-range transportation and pedestrian and safety plans. We also have the Hazard Mitigation Plan, which is aimed at reducing loss of life and property damage in the event of a disaster. And then while we're here today, our partnership with Partnership for Housing Affordability, to develop 263 affordable housing units throughout our region. And we'll talk more about that in a few. So in summary, PlanRVA is where we come together to look ahead. Tomorrow's solutions are born here. And so today I have the pleasure of introducing the newly appointed Executive Director for Partnership for Housing Affordability, Jovan Burton. Welcome, Jovan. Before jumping into the presentation though, I first want to understand why you do this work. So what about housing keeps you up at night?
Thank you for the introduction, Rashonda, and thank you all for tuning in. So, we'll get a little bit deeper in today's conversation around what's been going on in housing in our region and how PlanRVA has been contributing towards that and everything that we have to look forward to. But I think it's important, as you mentioned, to kind of start off with what are some of the biggest challenges we're seeing? And I think something that we look at a lot is, we had a lot of figures that I'll share that were pre-pandemic, and they were already fairly daunting in some cases in terms of just how many units we need and what our current supply looks like versus our future demand. But when you think about planning for our future, it's really the urgency of that has accelerated within the last 2 years, and our ability to keep up will really depend on how bold we're willing to be and the solutions that we pursue. And so, on a daily basis, on a monthly basis, there are dozens and hundreds of folks in our region who are looking for stable housing. And they have the means by which they could access it, but there's just not options for them to be able to accomplish that. And so what is our role in this region in making sure that we can create those conditions? Because as we continue to grow and grow and grow, if we don't address that, then that will become a much, much larger issue. So, just thinking out in this issue as a long-term play is something that I'm hopeful that we can be more and more aggressive about in this region.
Appreciate that, Jovan. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and jump into your presentation. And I'm excited that we're going to start with talking about the Richmond Regional Framework and the Regional Housing Framework and what it is and how we can support.
Absolutely. And are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So, I'll get started with the regional housing framework because I think it's essential that we understand as a region why it's important for us to collectively look at the issue of housing. And many places across the country are doing just this. They're thinking about how housing impacts their not only their future, but their economic competitiveness as a region, their ability to attract new employers, to attract skilled employees and folks of different means, right? And your ability to keep those folks here for a long period of time and for them to have a quality of life that I think we all think everyone deserves. And so housing plays a major role in that. And so if there's, housing instability in a certain area and someone moves within the region, well, they're in an unstable condition is very likely to follow them. And if the conditions aren't as welcoming or as abundant wherever they're going, that they're going to have that same issue. So what we always say as it relates to housing and thinking of this regionally is that housing challenges extend beyond jurisdictional lines. So it's really important to have that framing, and that's what the regional housing framework does. It's really a strategy, broad-based strategy that our localities here in the region can use in order to advance local housing policies that will create the conditions that we want to see. And thinking about the issue holistically. So looking at our senior population, looking at our rental market and our homeownership market, in addition to preserving the quality of the housing that we have currently, because it's just not feasible to build ourselves out of this issue. So the framework is really a holistic approach to addressing housing challenges and enabling local governments to work together and internally to figure out what's the best way for them to meet the needs of their community for today and for the next 10 to 20 years.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Javon.
And so I'll go a little bit further just to talk about, I think, what some of the biggest challenges that we face from a broad standpoint here in our region. Yes. Because a lot of folks probably are aware that rents are increasing, prices everywhere for just about every commodity, right? It's very difficult to maintain stability there. And that certainly is the case for housing. It was the case pre-pandemic. It's been more of the case since 2020. And the number of folks that we have in our region who are cost burdened or spending more than 30% of their income on housing, that number has surely increased within the last 5 years, certainly within the last 2 to 3 years. And pre-pandemic, we had nearly a third of all of our region's households were cost burdened or spending more than 30% of their income on housing costs, more than 50,000 of which were actually spending over half of their income on housing costs. So this is a considerable problem when you think about if someone is forced on a monthly basis to decide between paying for their rent or for groceries, to decide, do I forego critical medical bills or medicine that I need in order to pay for rent or to pay for their mortgage? So we fully expect that these numbers have gone up within the last 2 years, and we'll be able to confirm that this year when we update a lot of the data that you're seeing here that will reflect the changes from the pandemic. But I think what's most important to understand here is that even for folks who have gainful employment, who have incomes that in some cases can be upwards of $50,000, still can find themselves in a position where they're paying more than 30, 40, 50% of their income on housing, and it's not by choice. And that's where we see some of the challenges, and that's where we see a lot of people who are kind of forced out of the market and put in a position where they have to inhabit places that are not meant for permanent stability or shelter. Furthermore, for those individuals who are gainfully employed, who have steady incomes, the rate at which rents are increasing is far outpacing increases in income. So in the last 10 years prior to the pandemic, rents were outpacing income increases by about 2 to 1. So on average, rents were increasing 20% over a 10-year period, and income's only 10%. And so if you think about some of the fastest growing occupations in our region, some of those are jobs that only produce a monthly wage that commands a rent of around $1,000. per month. And in this current climate, that's just not feasible to find in many cases. Folks who are looking for something in that ballpark are going to not have many options to go to, no matter where they turn. And so it's becoming more and more inaccessible for a lot of low-income households who are employed, who have stability or would have stability if there were more options. And instead, they wind up paying for similar rates or even higher in places like hotels and motels. And then on the single family side, again, much of these rapid increases for single family home prices were prior to the pandemic. But even still, you can see how large the increases were and from 2009 to 2019. So 65% more expensive in the city of Richmond. And this is for all homes. If you look at new construction, it's even greater. It was 84% more expensive in the city of Richmond, 51% more expensive in Henrico County, and so on. So 2020 was, the best year for the real estate market in this century here in the Richmond region, and then that was surpassed by 2021. So you can only imagine how much more expensive housing is getting on the single family side, and what that's doing, particularly for first-time home buyers and their ability to gain access to wealth creation opportunities. Starter home inventory is few and far in between, and having to compete with investors or people who have cash for a lot of these properties, that's extremely difficult for a first-time home buyer, especially lower income households who are working with maybe a first-time home buyer mortgage program, or who are receiving down payment assistance. They still have to compete with everyone else in order to gain access. And despite maybe having the means to do so, it still is not enough because we just lack the inventory, quite frankly, to meet the need that we have in this region. But, despite some of those challenges, I do think it's important to look at what is happening in our region and the shift that the pandemic has created as a result of just some of the federal opportunities that have opened up. I think what we've seen is an exacerbation of our housing challenges. And because of that, our local governments in particular have paid much more attention and have been more intentional about addressing this issue. And there's a few examples here in which, Chesterfield and the city of Richmond both allocated a significant portion of their federal American Rescue Plan Act dollars towards affordable housing specifically. And these are significant investments, as anyone who's familiar with housing understands just how much more expensive this issue is than a lot of the other issues that maybe we would address in webinars and platforms like this. To build, one multifamily project these days could be anywhere between $30 and $50 million just for one property. And so housing is incredibly expensive. It requires a combination of revenue sources to finance deals, combination of debt. It's a serious investment with a lot of risk, and it's very difficult to do when everything is going right, and that much more difficult to do when, as it typically happens, issues arise during the development process. So it's great to see local governments making some of these larger investments and understanding the impact that housing has on their communities and why such large investments are necessary in order to meet our need. If we just think from a long-term perspective, our region prior to 2020 had a deficit of around 20,000 units, affordable units for low-income families in the region. And we're going to add 29,000 new low-income households between now and 2040. So even just to meet the future demand, not even thinking about how much we were already short, but just to meet the future demand, we would need to build well over 1,000 units per year between now and 2040, just to meet the demand of the incoming low-income housing population growth we're expecting to see in this region. And we're not producing at that rate right now. So that just shows the urgency, because on a yearly basis, that just going to far outweigh the supply that we have as things currently stand. And then in addition to local government investments, we have seen greater and greater philanthropic investments into housing. These are just a few examples here on the screen from both Altria and the Community Foundation for Greater Richmond, in which they made significant investments that will help create over 1,000 units in the next 3 years here in our region. Again, incredibly important to have not only the policy side of things, the advocacy side, the education side, but to really have the financing side helped out with from folks who are related to this space really goes a long way in ensuring that we can have a more equitable region in terms of having as many housing options for as many families as possible. Outside of the financing side, there are quite a few efforts that have been ongoing to better understand what are some of our greatest impediments. We understand money is always going to be a need, and at the local level, it's nearly impossible to be able to meet the needs and to address it from a financial standpoint. But there is a role that the local level can play, and sometimes it can be, contributing financially, and a lot of times it can be through understanding the need, exploring it, and addressing it through zoning and policy and land use. And so this is a great example in which local governments here in the region, the Tri-Cities, in addition to Chesterfield, Henrico, and the city of Richmond, they conducted a multi-jurisdictional analysis to understand what the impediments to fair housing were in our region. And PlanRVA was instrumental in this process. But what they identified was, more than anything, it really boils down to some of the zoning and land use barriers that are in place that serve as a large impediment to fair housing and greater housing choice in our region. So allowing for different housing types in more commercial or residential areas, relaxing some of those zoning restrictions would create the conditions through which we could have greater access to housing. And so that's what was identified in that analysis and can help inform future decisions at the local level to really show, just from a basic standpoint, folks have to have the ability to move around freely within the housing market, or at least to have more options than what they currently have. And that's just not the case at the moment, as evidenced by this report. So it's important that local governments are committed to exploring what this looks like in each of their jurisdictions and where some of those impediments, large barriers exist. And we have seen some zoning changes that really address what we've been talking about. One of them is the city allowing the by right construction of things like permanent supportive housing or emergency housing in more residential districts. This occurred in 2021, but it's so important because the fewer units we have the top of the market, that means less that we have the lower end of the market. And when it's much more competitive at the lower end, there are going to be folks who slip through the cracks. And in some cases, when that happens, folks enter into our homeless services system. That is a system that is specifically designed to be an intervention rather than a first resort. It's designed to be a last resort and a quick intervention so that someone can have stability and a shelter and quickly move into permanent housing. That's how our system is designed, so that shelter remains as available as possible for people who may be slipping through the cracks. But what we've seen exacerbated in the last 2 years is that people aren't able to move outside of shelter to permanent housing because the housing just doesn't exist. So folks are spending more time in shelter, and people who are waiting for shelter on the outside are spending more time either on the streets or in their cars or doubled up with other family members or friends. And so it just creates a logjam and an overburden of our homeless services system when we have fewer options of housing. So you see how these issues are really intertwined, and how not having enough access or an abundance of housing, what that leads to further down the road. So this is why zoning is so important, and really over the long term can help address and beat back some of the trends that we're seeing. And on the single family side, where zoning can play a role, this is a very common policy within our space around accessory dwelling units, or this idea of what some people refer to as granny flats. But the idea is that we have a lot of seniors in our region. We are adding 5 senior households every day for the next 20 years. So what does that mean for housing? What does that mean for seniors living by themselves who maybe don't have a caretaker on site, but who want to remain in the neighborhoods they've called home for many decades? And maybe they don't want to take on a new mortgage and move into a age-restricted community. And they want to stay there, but their current housing is not equipped to meet their changing health needs, accessibility needs. So accessory dwelling unit provides an additional option where it's already single level living. It's a much smaller dwelling unit. So it's something that is much more navigable than the primary unit. And it enables families to stay together so that the senior can stay in the neighborhood that they've been in for many, many years. And maybe a family member or family members can move on site in the primary dwelling unit. It can be attached or detached. There's a lot of options and flexibility with it. And so, Henrico has added accessory dwelling units to their zoning code update, which is kind of great strides towards what we're seeing more and more in our region. Multi-generational living is an increasing trend in our region. So we have to think, as we grow more diverse and thus living preferences certainly become more wide-ranging, do we have the kind of housing that accommodates that? Accessory dwelling units would be one way in which you could accommodate something like multi-generational living. But that's becoming more and more commonplace. That has increased by over 9,000 households since 2012 in our region, and that will continue to do so. So it's really thinking holistically, how can we meet as many housing preferences? How can we meet as many housing needs, as many income levels as we can with what we're allowing to be built in our communities? Is what zoning boils down to. So Rashonda, I could keep going on and on about this, but I'm sure there's a few other topics that we want to get to. So did you want to switch gears to maybe market value analysis or something related to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, just thinking about the market value analysis of 2020, we know that it has uncovered some troubling new data on learning that less than a third of the region's homes sold in 2021 were priced so that middle income residents could afford to buy them. And Jovan, I know that you are a member of the steering committee. Can you tell me about the study and how it connects to the?
Absolutely. So for those of you who are unaware, the market value analysis is a tool that is used all across the country. The Reinvestment Fund out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, started this tool in the early 2000s and has since used it in places in Alabama, has used it in Virginia and Richmond before, has used it in Pittsburgh and many other areas in larger metropolitan regions. But the purpose of it is to understand what's happening in specific neighborhoods. What makes one neighborhood have home values of 400,000 or 500,000 versus what factors contribute to other neighborhoods seeing some challenges in their housing market. So it's really a data-driven tool that looks at maybe there are some distressed markets. Let's understand why those markets are the way that they are, and what happens over time. So there was a market value analysis conducted a few years ago for our region, and this process is actually being completed once again for our region right now as we speak. And it's going to really look at what's happened to markets that were maybe struggling in 2018, 2019. Have they changed? Have they improved vastly? If so, what contributed to that? So that now we can begin to think more in a predictive manner and understand, okay, if these neighborhoods changed because of these factors, then these are the neighborhoods moving forward that we need to focus on and really focus a lot of our intervention and investment efforts to ensure that as that neighborhood maybe changes, it can do so in a more stable manner without displacing residents that are currently there, or ensuring that we see more different types of housing and not just a singular type of housing stock. So it's a data-driven tool that really helps target public and private investments And it's fascinating because we can understand down to truly a neighborhood level what has happened, what's ongoing, where are we seeing low vacancy rates, where are we seeing higher bank sales, where are we seeing the biggest increase in single family home sale prices, and why is that the case? And this is something in which local governments have been very hands-on in, and representative on that steering committee. So it's really exciting as we're wrapping up this process to see how we can use the data that comes out of this to inform our policy decisions around housing. So the regional housing framework is really policy solution driven. The more information we have, the more informed policies we can have. So that's why this tool is so important and why we think it's valuable to have completed once, twice, three, however many times for our region, because markets are going to continuously change. We are experiencing a lot of growth as a region. And so that has major implications for our housing markets and people's ability to continue to live here. If we want to stay competitive, then we need to be mindful of what those changes look like. So really excited about this tool, and I think it'll be essential to our understanding of where future public and private investments need to be focused.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Jovan. And also more about the market value analysis of 2020 is to come. It will be available on the PlanRVA website, so definitely be on the lookout for that. I want to segue into the Virginia Housing Grant. And so, so for our audience, PlanRVA and PHA received a $3 million grant from Virginia Housing to create new housing initiatives. Thus far, 10 projects have been awarded, and that will result in 263 new affordable housing units. So Jovan, can you give us a little bit more information about the type of housing projects, how the initial projects were selected? And yeah, do you have an approximate time on, when the first project from the last is to be completed?
Yeah, there's quite a bit to say here on this program because it's a brand new program that Virginia Housing started last year. And I think it speaks to what we started this webinar about, which is regionalism. This is an investment in our region, and this is what we're able to do with this funds and how we're able to leverage the funding from this program speaks to our capacity as a region and what happens when we work together. And so, PlanRVA, all PDCs were awarded funding across the state at different levels. And the goal is to produce a certain amount of affordable housing units to meet, underserved markets, to meet rural areas, to address single family and multifamily. And so PlanRVA decided to partner with our organization, the Partnership for Housing Affordability, in order to carry out this program. And we really decided to rely on our nonprofit capacity. We thought that we had enough nonprofits in this region who specialize in this work, and they have enough in their pipeline that they could more than easily take up and absorb the $3 million. And so we thought about the best way to allocate this funding in order to leverage it and have it, evenly spread across the region. And in the smaller jurisdiction pool, we really wanted to have our more rural localities compete against each other, that it would be more fair that way, and then to have an opportunity to have kind of similar properties or similar projects that would be produced and would be scored against each other. So these are the jurisdictions in the smaller pool, and then the jurisdictions in the larger pool, Chesterfield, Henrico, and the city of Richmond. And so based on that, we were able to allocate funding in this case for the small jurisdictions for 2 projects in Powhatan, 1 in Goochland, 1 in Hanover, and 1 in the town of Ashland. I think we had around 18 applications, and we're able to provide funding to well over half of those projects, which I think is a testament to how, again, well-equipped our nonprofit community is and how we were able to really leverage this funding. But all of these will be single-family homes, 2 of which will be completed this year. So I think that's also something to be aware of, is that this program has a timeline, a firm timeline of units being done by 2024. So we really wanted to prioritize projects that were either shovel ready or had as few obstacles to completing development as possible. So that's what it looks like in the smaller pool for now, at least. And then in the larger pool, you can see that we had one project in Henrico that will provide permanent supportive housing. And again, we wanted this funding to serve as gap financing. There are projects that have many, many different types of funding and subsidies, and we wanted this to serve as a gap, to fill a gap. Affordable housing development is essentially a math problem in which you have a cost and then you have revenue sources to fill it, and there's usually a gap. And the smaller that gap can be, the more affordable the units can be, and the more feasible the development is. And so we wanted to be able to help close gaps and these different deals. There were 2 projects in the city that got funding, and then 3 in Chesterfield County that were able to get funding. So this is a great show of regionalism. You'll see a good mix of single family and multifamily projects, and you'll see high quality projects. And I'll provide a few examples of those now, but you can see here some of the renderings of what to expect from these deals. And these are the 2 of the larger multifamily deals, one in Chesterfield on the bottom and the one on the top in Henrico County. But what I want to say about these is quality is something that is really prioritized in the affordable housing industry. And a lot of the financing for affordable housing dictates that what gets built is of the highest quality. Otherwise, you're not going to get funded, quite simply. So their requirements are that you use certain materials, or that you provide universal design elements for seniors or folks with disabilities, that you, just some of the most minute details in terms of design and development are required for the type of housing that we're talking about. And then on the single family side, this is just, again, examples of products that you can expect coming out of this funding and this program, that are just high quality units that will serve as wealth creation opportunities for many first-time homebuyer families. And then here's a before and after of the project in Henrico. It was previously an assisted living facility that has kind of been sitting vacant and blighted for quite some time. So before on the left, and then after that, this project is actually slated to break ground here in the next few weeks or so. So, hopefully within the next 2 years, we'll have, 86 new units of permanent housing for folks of really, really low incomes and with disabilities who require wraparound services on site. So this is providing a critical need here in our region. Any further thoughts on that, Rashonda?
Yeah, I appreciate that, Javon. And I know that we'll take some more questions. We'll take questions near the end, but I have some that have come up directly related to the Virginia Housing Grant. Mm-hmm. And so, question about what is the project in Hanover County?
Sure, and I'll go back just to show all of them. So the project in Hanover County is going to be a single family home that is being built by Hanover and King William Habitat for Humanity. Same organization is building the home in the town of Ashland. And so we actually just met with them this morning to discuss kind of a development update. And the Hanover project is actually going to be the first project that will be done in this program. It should be finished sometime this summer. So it'll be very, very cool to see that come online. And then the Ashland one will be done later this year. But yeah, it's a single family home by Hanover and King William Habitat.
Appreciate that. And then along those same lines, can you tell us a little bit about the one in Henrico?
Yeah, so that one is actually the assisted living facility. And again, it'll be 86 units. This is a very unique project where they're taking an old assisted living facility and turning it into a multifamily building. It's also unique in that it straddles both the city and Henrico. I think 5 acres of the property sit in Henrico, and about 0.3 of it sit in the city of Richmond, but the city actually owned the property. It was very unique in that sense, and required what we've been talking about throughout this presentation, required a lot of collaboration between the localities and regionalism. But that project is a great example of how difficult it is to do this kind of development. Virginia Supportive Housing is the organization building this project, and they serve a population that is probably our most vulnerable in terms of this industry. Folks that are extremely low income, that have developmental disabilities or permanent disabilities, and thus not only do they require the housing, but also wraparound services on site. So it's incredibly expensive to build this type of housing. We don't see it as much as the need is, and it can take, sometimes 3 to 4 years from conception to completion for a deal like this, which has kind of been the case. It's going to be called Cool Lane Apartments, so it's on Cool Lane, and it's again, it's been hampered by the pandemic, by construction cost increases and supply chain and many other challenges that have, extended kind of the development process for this deal. But once completed, it will be serving an essential community need here in our region, because we just don't have enough permanent supportive housing for that population.
Appreciate that, Javon. And I know there's more that we wanted to talk about with the state of housing and rent relief, and I want to get into those. But I really wanted to take a step back, as I know that there's been intentionality behind making sure that, some of the funds are dedicated to our smaller and more rural localities. Can you share a little bit more about the background on why those funds are being allocated in that way? So thinking about those smaller and rural localities, and then any update on when those announcements, the spring announcements, might be made?
Yeah, so thank you for bringing that up. We actually did not allocate all of the funding in the fall when we made some of these decisions. There was $250,000 that was withheld for a future allocation. That application is out right now, and we reserved that for just our smaller, more rural jurisdictions. So for New Kent, Charles City, Ashland, Hanover, Goochland, and Powhatan. So to take the remaining $250,000. So that we're going to see some applications come in, and there'll be some more projects, hopefully, that are able to get funded. But it was really important for us because, one, Virginia Housing made it clear that they want this program to serve a need that was not being met previously, right? So as things where there are very few funding options at the federal level, at the state level, for jurisdictions that are smaller and more rural. Quite frankly, that's just how it is. There's less funding opportunities. So it makes it that much more difficult to get projects like this done. And Virginia Housing really wanted this program to focus on underserved markets, to focus on rural areas, to emphasize first-time home ownership. And we knew that was the need that could be met by Goochland, Hanover, New Kent, Charles City, Powhatan. So we knew it was essential to have, them competing against each other as opposed to competing against the entire region. And we also knew that we need a mix of single family and multifamily. Our needs are not just on the multifamily side, they're on the single family side too. And it's very difficult to be a first-time home buyer right now and to gain access to the market. There are very few options. So we knew how important it was also to demonstrate that, this kind of development can be done, and maybe areas where previously it was much more difficult. So it's almost like a proof of concept, and investing in the nonprofits who really do tremendous work and have a lot of hurdles and obstacles to get development done sometimes. But we will have decisions on this spring allocation of the remaining $250,000 in May. And those projects will have to adhere to the same timeline and criteria as the other projects, have to be completed by July of 2024. So things are moving pretty quickly, and I think we'll see a lot more movement here in the coming years in the region.
Thanks, Javon. And then last question before we open it up to the audience. We have some great questions in the chat. My colleague Sid is also monitoring our YouTube chat, and so thank you for being here again. And we will get to your questions. Just lastly, so the pandemic, really shined a light on the disparities in housing just across our region. And a lot of efforts were made, one of those being the rent relief program. Can you tell us just about how the pandemic, had impacted housing in the region, and what that means for the rent relief program, understanding that it isn't permanent? And so what can we expect to see when that program ends?
Yeah, I wanted to find the slide that I had for it. So, rent relief obviously was an opportunity. It came out of the pandemic, and everywhere in the country, right, there's been rent relief allocated, and Virginia has allocated the money fairly efficiently. I mean, as efficient as any other state in the country. And in particular, I know that Chesterfield County decided to partner with a local organization, that being Area Congregations Together in Service, also known as ACTS. And through that partnership, last year alone, they were able to allocate $17 million in rent relief to Chesterfield County residents. And you can see how many individuals that helped, nearly 3,000 children, over 2,200 households. That's funding that is still continuing to be distributed in Chesterfield. The other localities in our region, they deferred their money to the state so that their residents in those jurisdictions go to the state in order to access rent relief, whereas Chesterfield, it's being distributed locally through a local nonprofit. But either way, I think it's important to understand how important these programs, this rent relief has been to keeping families stably housed and avoiding evictions, but also how great the need still is. Programs like the one you see here on your screen are going through literally hundreds of thousands of dollars in a week, sometimes in a day. And that shows you how great the need still is. So I think there's a lot of concern as some of these programs begin to run dry and are tapering off, what that's going to mean. And it's going to be pretty challenging, most likely, but I think it's also been a testament to how well Chesterfield and ACTS have worked together to distribute this funding and to ensure that it's going to the folks that need it, as well as the state program to meet the needs of the other jurisdictions and their residents. So a lot of money has been allocated, which is great. It's been allocated very quickly, which is also great. But with that, it will run out eventually. And, are we prepared for that as a region? We'll have to see. But, we have very low vacancy rates. It will be extremely competitive. Rents are rising. So once there's more movement and turnover in the market, we're all kind of curious as to what that will hold for a lot of households here in the region.
Thanks, Jovan. Appreciate that. So the chat is open as well as the Q&A. This portion is open to hear from our audience members. We appreciate the opportunity to hear from you. Our first question came in from YouTube. And so, Jovan, the question is, can you discuss briefly how housing and transportation planning can better work together, particularly how transportation costs factor into housing costs?
That's a great question. We have always been asked, should we work more closely with things like transportation, education, so on and so forth? Because quite frankly, there's a lot of folks in our region who, rely on public transportation to get to and from jobs. And I mean, how they're related, it's probably best illustrated by a study that was done a few years ago for this region that looks at the jobs and housing imbalance in our region. So jobs are located for many of the folks who are low incomes, located in kind of one area, and the housing is located in another, and not connected at all. And the transportation system isn't adequate enough to really serve and meet the two. So that's a big challenge. Now, existing housing programs like the tax credit program, that's the number one way that affordable housing is built in the region, in the state, and in the country. That encourages projects to be located, within a quarter mile of public transportation stops. You get more points in your application if you have a project that is located near that. So, that's good, but that doesn't mean that you have to. And in some cases, in some areas, that's much more difficult to do as transportation gets more and more sparse, depending on where you are. So, what we encourage, and one of the best ways to address that is looking at mixed use development. So maximizing, your existing commercial corridors. If you can have housing integrated within that, where you're having housing with jobs, with groceries and other amenities, in addition to transportation, it makes things that much more seamless because you're not having to necessarily expand service where the need's not currently being met. Then you put the need where the services are and go from there. So that's a big focus, is how can you have more mixed use development, and that comes back to zoning. How densely can you build in certain areas, or does it allow for residential and commercial on a certain site, where you can even have, first floor is commercial and above it is residential. So it makes things much more accessible. So from a cost standpoint, I'm not entirely sure if there's at least any local clear-cut studies as to, what the costs are of being located further and further away from transportation are. But it's very clear that we have a lot of folks in the region who need more affordable housing, but also aren't located near transportation. We get calls about that through the program that we run, our housing hotline that serves the region, very frequently. People who, on top of their housing need, they have a transportation need, and they even have a job need. Maybe they got a new job, don't know how they're going to get there though. And so that is a big challenge that we do see.
Thanks, Siobhan. And that just reminded me of our long-range transportation plan, Connect 2045, along with our Bike Pit RVA 2045 plan, which is a call for active transportation and for us to provide safer options for our bicyclists, for our pedestrians, for folks who scoot, who use mobility assisted devices. And so just that. And it also segues into a comment that we have here is about the concern that affordable housing not being located, on a bus line route, further compounding the problems that we see for trying to get to, education facilities, medical facilities, jobs, and shopping, which you also addressed. We received another comment that there's a huge problem with the cash sales by investors, which is keeping home buyers from being able to pay a fair price in the market. Mm-hmm. Any comments that you have on that, Jovan?
Yeah, I'll say that it's been something we're concerned about on the single family and multifamily side. And when I spoke earlier about preserving what we have, it wasn't just the quality comment, it's also just the number of units that we have. Like we spend so much time focusing on how can we add to our existing stock, all the while we may be losing some of our stock because of what we're talking about in terms of investors with cash who maybe buy properties sight unseen from out of state. And in some cases, it could be someone who was renting out their single family property to maybe someone who was of lower means in terms of income. And to seller's market right now, it's very, very enticing to sell property. And so they sell it, and that individual has to quickly find somewhere else to live. And as I said, a lot of the social service providers in our region who provide down payment assistance and homebuyer education for first-time homebuyers, they've really been expressing in the last year how they have clients who are ready. They've done the credit counseling, they have their credit score, they've been approved for a loan, but just being able to compete with others is so difficult in this climate right now. But that's why on the single family side, it's great that we have programs like the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust, because that effectively creates first-time homebuyer opportunity in perpetuity for households in this region, lower income households in this region. It backs the land out of the sales price. You only pay for the cost of the home, which is much more affordable than what you would get on the market. So if a home was, $265,000 total, the land trust home would really go for around maybe 210 or 205 after backing the land out of the price, which is much more attainable for a first-time home buyer. So we have some of those preventative kind of preservation efforts in place. but it's quite concerning to see what we're seeing as far as just first-time home buyers not being able to access the market. And then on the multifamily side, we're also seeing and concerned about some properties that maybe are serving folks of lower incomes that are getting bought up by investors and converted to market rate or converted to much higher rents. And so folks who have been living there can no longer afford to live there. And so we're actually could be losing some of our existing affordable stock while not gaining enough of it in terms of the new construction. So it's kind of on both sides what we're seeing some of those push factors because of the climate of the last 2 years.
Appreciate that, Jovan. We have a question from the Q&A. It says, I'm curious about RVA's vision for public housing's long overdue replacement, relocation, and best practices associated with such ill-considered neighborhoods. I know Creighton is in transition. Other details, perhaps there is a plan we can read.
Yeah, personally, I don't have any details beyond what you all probably are aware of. I mean, we certainly know that RHA is embarking on a transformation of their public housing communities, starting with Creighton and doing that in multiple phases. The Armstrong Renaissance project that was fairly close to Creighton, that was one of the ways in which folks who wanted to move into those new units could do so if that's what they please. And those units have been completed and they look really nice. But I think I can speak to it more broadly in that, public housing is something that is from a federal level administered by HUD, Department of Housing and Urban Development. And HUD has been very consistent in its philosophy in the last 10, however many years, that they're moving away from the traditional model of public housing and moving towards, private development really taking over and having mixed income communities and having, communities that are more densely built so that you can have more units in those properties. And so that's kind of what a lot of public housing authorities are having to do and having to figure out the best way to navigate that. And so partnering with private developers to figure out to have more scattered sites across the city as they move away from the traditional model and replacement of public housing as we've known it for quite some time. So I don't have more details than that on the specific plans, but that's a really good question because it's a very critical housing need in our region. There are really no other programs that serve that specific need. And it's very important to have in our region.
And before we wrap up, Jovan, I know you shared earlier in the presentation that, HUD has standards to make sure that, these housing units that we are building, meet high expectations and that they are, habitable. And so how is affordable housing taking climate change into consideration?
That's a really interesting question because again, I'll go back to the tax credit program, the main way that affordable housing gets built. And that's a program that incentivizes a lot of things, one of them being sustainability. So you get more points on your application. And the more points that you have, the more likely you are to get funded. So you get more points in your application if you're going to have, Earthcraft certification, if you're going to use certain building materials, if you're going to get a LEED certification, or if you're going to use, certain type of products to save energy, to save on energy cost within the housing units. So it incentivizes it in that way. I think one of the challenges is development is already so costly. And, sometimes there's probably the perception that there's only so much more cost that, especially nonprofits can take on. And, is it a question of, is it feasible to add on certain? So it boils down to each individual development, but it is incentivized in some of the financing programs that we have in the affordable housing space. But it boils down to what is a nonprofit able to afford and the development costs.
Appreciate that. And so we are going to begin to wrap up now. Sid, if you're able to get our closing slide posted. But Javon, thank you so much for your time today, for doing this work and just allowing us, PlanRVA, to be a part of implementing the regional framework. We hope each of you here enjoyed the webinar today. There's so many great things happening in the Richmond region. The Better Together webinar is a platform to highlight our everyday heroes like Jovan that are working to make the Richmond region a safer and more equitable place for all to thrive. We hope that you will join us for our next Better Together webinar on April 21st at 2 p.m. Our special guest will be Kim Hines, Executive Director of Central Virginia Waste Management Authority. A reminder that our Bike Ped RVA 2045 public comment period is still open until March 23rd. If you haven't already, please head over to bikepedrva.org to view the plan and give us feedback. We'd love for you to follow us and stay connected by following us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, as well as our YouTube. And then PlanRVA and PHA's partnership is proof of what can happen when we work together. As the African proverb goes, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. At PlanRVA, we believe we are better together. See you next time.